Winter lay heavy over Lone Mesa Ranch, the kind of cold that quieted even the bravest dawn. Snow pressed against the horizon, softening the rough edges of the world. Frost clung to fence rails and silver sheets, and the cattle moved like ghostly shapes in the pale morning light. Inside the cookhouse, where the first spark of fire cracked open the silence, Bridget Morrow stood alone. She watched her breath drift into the icy air, moving with a careful grace as if trying not to disturb the quiet that had settled over her life. The left side of her face, touched by an old burn, caught the lantern glow. The scar seemed carved from moonlight rather than fire. She kept her hair pinned back, her apron tied tight. Every morning she prepared biscuits before the hands woke, kneading dough with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned that silence was safer than attention. She stirred pots as if tending small, fragile hopes. The stove warmed her hands, but could not melt the memory of all the doorways she had walked out of, all the stares she had learned to read like verdicts. Still she stayed gentle. Still she stayed kind. The world had taken enough from her. She would not let it take her softness, too. As dawn settled, the ranch hands drifted in, stamping snow from their boots. Roscoe Tate, the oldest among them, nodded toward her with a warmth he offered sparingly. Others followed with shy gratitude, inhaling the comforting scent of cinnamon and hot bread. They never looked long enough to make her shrink, nor short enough to pretend she wasn't there. It was a quiet balance she appreciated, one that let her exist without feeling examined. She served them with small smiles, the kind that flickered but never held steady, as though bravery was measured in glances. The peace didn't last long. The door swung open, Cold riding in with a man who looked polished in a way the ranch never asked for. Deputy Lyle Carter stepped inside, his dark coat trimmed with unnecessary pride. His boots struck the floor harder than needed, and his eyes scanned the room, searching for something to criticize. Bridget felt his gaze before it landed on her. It came sharp and fast, catching her scar like a hook. The faintest curl of distaste pulled at his lip, the kind she had seen too many times to mistake. A few ranch hands stiffened, sensing the shift. Lyle leaned toward a visiting merchant beside him and muttered low, but not low enough. The words moved through the room like a cold draft. The cook's face might unsettle the family's coming tonight. Folks shouldn't have to look at something like that while eating. Bridget froze, her hands still curled around the serving ladle. For a moment she stood suspended between breath and shame, the room spinning slightly, as if the insult had nudged the world off its axis. She had faced worse in towns less kind, but hearing it here, in a place where she had begun to feel a fragile belonging, pierced deeper than she expected. The whisper traveled quickly, though no one repeated it. Silence held the room like frost sealing a window. Bridget's pulse throbbed in her scar, a small, trembling ache. She set the ladle down with deliberate calm, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped forward. Her voice rose softly, but there was no tremor in it. "If my scarred face offends your guests, I'll leave." She said it as one states a fact, not a plea. For a heartbeat no one moved. Even the stove flames seemed to quiet themselves. Lyle offered a shrug that carried neither apology nor thought. "It's best for appearances," he murmured, still pretending his cruelty was simple practicality. She didn't look at him again. The cold inside her chest felt older than him, older than any ranch or western frontier. She had walked away from places that judged her for less, and she had learned that dignity sometimes meant stepping out before someone pushed. But before she could turn toward the door, another voice broke the stillness. It came from the back of the room, low and steady, the voice of a man who rarely spent more than 3 words at a time. Silas Harding, owner of Lone Mesa Ranch, stepped forward. Snow still clung to his coat collar. His boots made the softest sound against the wooden floor, yet each step felt like a promise being shaped. He had the kind of presence that didn't need raising his voice or showing anger. Calm radiated from him like heat from a hidden ember. He looked at Bridget first, not at her scar, but directly into her eyes, as though searching for the part of her that had spoken with such quiet resignation. "You're not leaving," he said, the words gentle yet unwavering. Then he turned to Lyle with a gaze carved from winter stone. "No one who works here leaves for a coward's opinion." The words slid through the room like a blade wrapped in velvet, striking without shouting. Lyle recoiled, unsure how to respond to a man who commanded both silence and respect effortlessly. Silas stepped closer to Bridget, his voice soft enough that only she felt the warmth of it, yet loud enough that every witness understood. "You belong here more than any guest who judges people by the marks life gave them." Something trembled inside her chest, a faint shiver not born of cold but of being defended in a way she had long forgotten existed. She tried to speak, but her throat closed around the attempt. For the first time in years, she didn't know whether to stay or to flee. He gestured to the chair near the fire, a small place she had never dared sit. "Rest a moment, Bridget. Let the heat find you." She hesitated. Then slowly she moved toward the hearth, feeling every eye shift from curiosity to something softer. Snow drifted past the window, catching light from the rising sun. Lyle stiffened, realizing his words had cost him more than a morning's pride. But the hurt he inflicted had already begun to reshape itself inside Bridget into something else, something steadier. As she settled by the fire, Silas stood behind her, silent, thoughtful. The warmth crawled up her scar like a gentle hand. She wondered, with a strange tightening in her chest, why a man who owed her nothing would choose to stand beside her. And Silas, watching the flames reflect across her wounded cheek, wondered why the sight of her nearly walking out felt like losing something he had only just begun to understand. Snow thickened across the plains, as if winter wished to muffle every sound and slow every heartbeat. The ranch rose each morning beneath that white hush, fences bowed under frost, horses snorting steam into the frozen air. Within the cookhouse, warmth blossomed from the old iron stove, and Bridget Morrow moved through it with the soft steadiness of someone rebuilding themselves grain by grain. She worked quietly, sleeves rolled to her elbows, breath rising in pale clouds each time she stepped near the drafty door. Her scar warmed in the firelight, no longer hidden, though she still found herself turning slightly left whenever footsteps approached. Small habits learned from years of surviving the sting of eyes. Silas Harding had not mentioned the incident again, and that silence, instead of unsettling her, felt like a coat slipped over her shoulders on a cold day. He moved through the ranch with his usual calm, feeding horses, repairing fences, clearing snowdrifts with the quiet endurance of a man who carried winter inside him like a companion. Yet something subtle had shifted. Whenever Bridget looked up from her work, she caught the faint awareness of his presence, not invasive, not lingering, simply there, as though he sensed the air tremble around her whenever memories clawed their way up. Roscoe Tate took notice first. The old hand leaned his elbow on the counter, inhaling the scent of her biscuits. "You're baking like someone trying to hush her own thoughts," he murmured without accusation. She smiled faintly and brushed flour from her cheek. "Some thoughts never hush." Roscoe nodded, the way a man does when he's seen enough winters to recognize invisible weight. Then he carried his plate outside, leaving her with a warmth she didn't expect. June Delaney pushed through the door soon after, cheeks flushed from hauling hay. Her boots thudded against the floor as she set down a sack of feed. She gave Bridget a bright smile, one of those unguarded ones that felt like a lantern held up in the dark. "Heard about the commotion yesterday. Folks can be fools, but Silas isn't one of them." Bridget busied her hands with the coffee pot, unsure what to say. June stepped closer, voice gentler. "You deserve better than the way he spoke to you. I'm glad Silas shut him down." Bridget didn't look up, but she felt a small warmth twist in her chest, gentler than the fire, deeper than thanks. Outside the day grew wind-bitten, and the ranch settled into the rhythm of surviving the cold. Bridget brought bowls of stew to the men working the stables, her boots crunching through snow. She found Silas repairing a gate hinge made brittle by frost. He accepted the bowl from her with a nod, brushing snow from his gloves before holding it. His gaze lingered on her face, not the scar, but the calm she carried despite it. "Thank you," he murmured. She hesitated, then whispered, "You didn't have to defend me that way." Silas looked toward the distant hills where the sky faded into soft gray. "Sometimes the right thing is the quiet thing." She didn't know whether he meant defending her or something else entirely. As days passed, winter tightened its grip. The cattle huddled near the lower pasture, and the ranch hands wrapped scarves around their faces to ward off the biting wind. Bridget found comfort in routine, stirring pots, preparing bread, roasting winter vegetables. Yet every time Silas pushed open the cookhouse door, snow swirling behind him, something in her steadied. He always greeted her with a warmth that seemed unearned, yet she found herself waiting for it almost without meaning to. He'd linger at the counter, warming his hands near the stove, listening as Roscoe told stories of old cattle drives or June recounted mishaps with stubborn horses. And though he rarely spoke, his presence alone softened the day. Little Eli Cross, the youngest hand, followed Bridget like a shadow. He admired how she moved through work without complaint, how she offered him extra cornbread when he looked especially cold. One afternoon, as she bandaged a cut on his finger, Eli whispered, "Folks shouldn't say cruel things about you. You cook better than anybody in Wyoming." Bridget blinked hard, tying the bandage with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she said, noticing Silas leaning quietly against the doorframe, listening without intruding. Yet the peace they built was fragile. Lyle Carter returned 3 days later, bringing with him the same puffed pride and polished boots. He walked through the ranch with unearned authority, as though trying to reclaim the dignity Silas had taken from him. A palpable tension settled over the room, the kind that precedes a storm. All eyes were on Bridget, or more specifically on the jagged scar that traced a path from her temple to her jaw. It was a road map of a past she'd fought hard to survive, a story etched into her skin. But in the cruel gaze of Lyle, it was nothing more than a flaw, a blemish on an otherwise lovely canvas. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips, his voice laced with a casual cruelty that cut deeper than any blade. "What happened to your face?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a foul odor. "Did you get in a cat fight or something?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the group, but most people just shifted uncomfortably, averting their eyes. Bridget's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard it all before, the whispers, the stares, the thinly veiled insults. Each one was a fresh prick on an old wound. She opened her mouth to deliver one of her practiced, non-committal replies, the armor she'd built around herself over the years. But before she could speak, a new voice sliced through the tension, firm and unwavering. "That's enough, Lyle." It was Silas. He hadn't been part of their immediate circle, but he'd been close enough to hear. He moved to stand beside Bridget, his presence a sudden, unexpected shield. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, were fixed on Lyle, devoid of any amusement. Lyle, taken aback, scoffed. "What? I was just asking a question." "No," Silas countered, his voice low and steady. "You were being a jerk." "There's a difference." The air crackled. Lyle, clearly not accustomed to being challenged, flushed a dark red. He muttered something under his breath and turned away, his moment of power play deflated. The conversation in the room slowly resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. The storm had broken, not with a downpour, but with a quiet act of courage. Bridget looked at Silas, truly looked at him for the first time. He wasn't looking for thanks or praise. He was simply watching her, a question in his eyes. She gave him a small, hesitant smile, the first genuine smile that had touched her lips all evening. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He just nodded, his gaze softening. "No one should have to answer for their scars," he said, his voice so gentle it almost made her want to cry. In that moment, something shifted inside her. For years her scar had been a source of shame, a wall she kept between herself and the world. But Silas didn't see a flaw. He saw a person. He saw her. They spent the rest of the evening talking, their conversation flowing as easily as a river. He asked about her passions, her dreams, the books she loved, everything but the one thing everyone else seemed to fixate on. And when it was time to leave, he walked her to the door. Under the soft glow of the porch light, he gently reached out, his fingers tracing a path just beside her scar, never touching it, but acknowledging it with a reverence that took her breath away. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It's a part of your story." Tears welled in Bridget's eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of pain or shame. They were tears of hope. In the kindness of a stranger, she had found an acceptance she'd stopped looking for. I promised that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to hide anymore. Maybe her scars weren't just a map of her past, but a beacon for a brighter future. And as he smiled at her, she knew this was the beginning of a new chapter. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe for more.